Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me once again. I know we are moving backwards from chapter 2 to chapter 1, but I think it is important for us to actually have a better grasp of some of the more interesting topics. And then now coming back to Genesis chapter 1, we'd like to actually answer some of the tougher questions that everybody asks. And then what I intend to do is to have this in two sections. Day 1 to day 3 and day 4 to day 7 in a Q&A fashion in two sessions. And so today, there are some things which you probably will hear me say, which you probably will never have heard before, or you may have heard, but you didn't quite understand. My intent this evening is actually to show you the underlying Hebrew that the English may not be able to express very well. However, as the Hebrew is expressed, you would find that some of these meanings may change the reading as well. So let me just get along, and then as we go along, you probably will see what I mean. I want to begin with some set of information that I think would be very useful. And as we look at Genesis chapter 1, the first chapter of the Bible, and the very beginning as God speaks to man, there should be some background information that I hope that I can paint you with as well, and how the Hebrew may be able to uncover a lot more than the English. We should bear in mind that Genesis chapter 1 is not a science lecture, right? It is not. That's my emphasis here. It's not a science lecture. The reason being is that it is a narration of what God did. So it is not a science debate. It is not here to uncover a lot of the laws and the mysteries of the universe, although everything narrated about science will be scientifically explainable. All right, so that should be the first background. I know there's a lot of debates going on to decide and to explain how the origins of the universe and the origin of life and all these things happen, but I would suggest that when you look at the Hebrew of the Genesis 1, you find that it is not anything to do with science at all. The second thing I like all of us to be aware of is that it is not about everything God has ever made, but it is about what He wants us to know. That's important. Otherwise, we will have 1,001 questions about things which is not said at all. And then it would force us to speculate, and at worst, we make things up along the way. So I hope that we, as we read Genesis 1, remember that it is not about everything under the sun that God has ever made. It is about what He wants us to know specifically. Now, the third thing is you should realize, if not by now, I've said it many times, Genesis 1 is not originally in the English language. It is actually in what we call Biblical Hebrew, which is not today's Hebrew, but it's an older form of Hebrew with a slightly varied set of linguistic rules. But more importantly, I think that not many people tell us this. Genesis 1, some people say it's all poetry, so you cannot take it at face value. I am now making a statement that it is not Hebrew poetry. If you want Hebrew poetry, we should be looking at the Psalms. So Genesis 1 and 2, and some people will say 3 as well, that they are all just poetry and you cannot take it seriously. I, for one, would venture to tell us all today, I would probably take the position that Genesis 1 is not Hebrew poetry. It is a historical narrative. However, it does have some element of poetic style. So a historical narrative with poetic style does not make it Hebrew poetry, so to speak. Now, what is Genesis 1 really all about? My contention would be this: if you bear this in mind, that it will make Genesis 1 very easy to understand. I would share with you my learnings. Number one, Genesis 1 is about God's lesson plan to teach man how to live. It is at a time when man is newly created, newly formed, like we talked about, squeezed out of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living nefesh. But he needs to be trained. He needs to be told. It's like a child born into this world, able to live but don't know what to do. Why are we here? What do we do? How do we count? So the second thing is, it is about God wanting man to count, to keep track of important days. And so two things would be very important for us to remember. God is teaching us how to live some of the basic elements of life. Number two, counting about life is very important so that we know the focus of movement of our lives and of our time. Now, the third thing about Genesis 1 is disclosed in this particular way is to tell us enough about what God did, how things were made. Because God had expressed in a number of verses in chapter 1, and just for us to realize that it's not by accident. Now, the last thing that I think that we should be mindful of is that it is in a particular order, and each day has a function, and it is to tell us that it is not chaotic and things are not here by chance. And so this in itself is important information for us to have while we study Genesis 1. But in a nutshell, if we forget everything I have just said, Genesis 1 is really about God. And we call him Elohim for this purpose, because that's the Hebrew word for God, translated as God, and we'll get there shortly. And not only about God, it is to know God. And I think that in itself should be the pinnacle and the chief, most paramount thing about Genesis 1. We should not be asking about the science question, but we should be asking who God really is. That's the intent of God giving us Genesis 1, I think. So I want you to sit back and think with me. I suggest that it is very likely that this is at a time when the children of Israel was at the eastern side of the Jordan River. Now, these were a bunch of children, probably around the age of 20, with the likes of Joshua and Hur. And you would see that the older generation had died off, with the exception of Moses, of course. And so this setting could be at a campfire. It could be a campfire narrative, right? And Moses was actually describing not the earth, but the land that they are about to inherit. And as they look up to the skies, then Moses is describing how all the things that they have seen on the land and the sky came to being. But more importantly, the who that brought all of them into being, so that they can remember this God as they enter the land. And that I think would be a good paradigm for us to have when you read Genesis chapter 1. A little background about Hebrew. Hebrew language is actually very much designed for hearing, all right? Which is why throughout the Hebrew Bible, as well as even in the New Testament, you hear this Hebrew phrase, He who has an ear, let him hear. It's all about hearing. And so the Shema is about hearing. Hear ye, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And why? It's because the hearing is because they never had the Bible with them, or what they call the scrolls. It was all about somebody reading out and everybody seated to listen very attentively. And Genesis 1 will then play the movie, a very vivid movie, in the minds of the hearers, so that with every Hebrew word spoken, it captivates their attention as to what God did and how God did it. Did what? His creative work, his work. It is called work because God did something, right? So that the children of Israel can be at awe with God. So when they see in their minds what God did, this is what they want to invoke: awe of God, and make sure that they remember him always when they enter the land. Also remember, Hebrew is a very action-oriented language, and which means that verbs are important, so that when you hear those verbs, the action words, it will cast and conjure the vivid imagery and the vivid movie in the mind. And so verbs are the primary expressions of the tools used in the Hebrew language. And hence, as it's being spoken, you can literally imagine all the activities that's happening. Before I go on, I really want you to understand that it is literally very difficult to translate Hebrew into English in its entirety. And so when we have the English Bible, we have what the translators would call the English equivalent. And they will try to find and choose what they think would be an English equivalent. Now, having done the translation of Genesis, I really would want us to understand that there are a few Hebrew words that cannot find an actual English equivalent because it does not exist in our vocabulary. And hence, in this particular session, I have proposed to retain their transliteration so that you understand that this is an original Hebrew word and it has a set of meanings to it, and so that there's no one English word that would fairly represent it. So let's begin. Some of the questions that people ask is this: does Genesis 1:1 mean something? I mean, is it the beginning of something? What is it, beginning of time? What does create actually mean? What is the significance of it? And we've always been told that create has always mean make something out of nothing. Is that what it means? And so let me try to explain some of these things from Genesis 1:1. So remember, Genesis 1:1, in my mind, as I'm sharing with you, it is describing the purpose of this chapter. It's the summary verse. It is the, well, what we call the preamble or the abstract of the entire chapter. It literally, in one verse, describes the entire chapter's purpose. So what does Genesis 1:1 actually say? So let me give you this understanding. Now, again, I reiterate, some of the things I am telling you would be new, and some of the things may challenge some status quo, but doesn't matter. What's important is don't believe everything I say. Please check, please verify, and please test all things. What I'm trying to show you is to uncover the Hebrew meanings underneath the English words. The first words I want to point out to you is this: we've always been told, in the beginning. But I have chosen to translate it as at first, for a very simple reason. At first does not insert the article the, because the article the does not appear in this verse at that point in time. So this particular the is inserted by the translators. So if I use at first, I don't insert anything to imply anything else beyond what it's said. So I had really preferred the word at first to in the beginning. This is something which you need to then figure out, and whether this is telling you the better picture or not. I'm saying at first because it sounds like this is the beginning of this story. Okay, this is the beginning of the story and not the beginning of time and space. Now, in the Hebrew, you find that it is very peculiar. I'm not teaching you Hebrew today. I'm just trying to show you this is the key. Because verbs are the most important. So this verb here, bara, will be something which you must check out because it will tell us which direction to take when we read Genesis chapter 1. Now, again, I highlighted to you that there is no verb in beginning here. It really doesn't have. So it does not exist in the Hebrew, but it exists in the heavens and the earth. And so I'm of the opinion that when it gives us the definite article, the, then we should put it in. And if it doesn't have a definite article, we shouldn't insert in because it will mislead the English reader like ourselves. And so this is how I would suggest that we translate the word create. I am saying that it should mean fill and not create for a simple reason. Because create has given us a very different meaning. For a long time, the word create, as we know it, tends to say make something out of nothing. That's how we've always been told, and that's how we've been taught as well. But I am suggesting that fill is better because the word create never, and so let me highlight this word, it never means make something out of nothing. You'd be surprised. It always means to fill, to form, to shape something new from something that is already there. If you are not convinced, then I suggest that you should spend some time to go through every verse that uses the word bara. And this is the word that we have translated as create. And all through the Bible, the word bara and its variations never means make something out of nothing. But it always means to fill, form, shape something new from something that is already there. And this verb is actually in a singular. And that is important as well, because we would be asking the next question. So let me just share with you. This is important for us to spend a minute on. The key to Genesis 1 is actually this word bara. If we say at first Elohim filled the skies, then the key is this process of filling. It is the first part of this work in the entire chapter. It presumes, so there is a certain number of assumptions. The assumption would be if it is about filling, then the skies and the land would have existed as we speak. They were unfilled, and so they need to be filled by God. And so that would be the summary of this key verse. However, if you think that the beginning is about creating everything from nothing and the beginning of time, then that would be your focus. The focus is not in the create. The focus is very much about the beginning, right? And it presumes everything did not exist at this point in time, and neither did time itself. So it is something that you have to decide for yourself, because at this juncture, if you choose A1, which we will carry on, then it will take us down a path. And if you choose 2, it will take you into a slightly different path. And hence, you need to then grapple with this yourself. I'm highlighting this to you because it is truly a major point that all of us need to make a decision on. Now, if Elohim truly means fill, then number 2 is out of the question. And so my challenge to you this evening is, do your homework, go through the entire Bible, at least the Old Testament, and check all the words that has bara and its variants, and you will never find making something out of nothing, but you will always find fill, form, and shape. The next thing I want to point out to you is the word Elohim. Now, the word Elohim is important because it is preferred over God. The reason I'm saying that is because in the ancient texts, we don't have an English word called God. And so we have the word El, and Elohim itself is the plural of the word El. And it actually means mighty one. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is not God, the creator of the world. I'm saying that this is what the Hebrew meaning gives us. Because the word Elohim is very similar to the Chinese Shen or Sun, where it refers to the creator, which we are familiar with. It also is used for angels, for kings, judges, powerful men like generals, right, and heroes. It also refers to idols, the false gods of the world. And so how do we determine the meaning of this word? The context. That's it, the context. But it is nevertheless in a plural noun, but combined with a singular verb, which we saw in bara. And so from a Hebrew context and a linguistic context, Elohim is a special word because oftentimes you find this plural form of El. Let me show you. The singular is El. The plural is Elohim. And so this plural form of El can also be used as a singular. And in the biblical Hebrew linguistic, it's called the majestic plural, right? It's like the word skies. The skies are not always blue. But why is it skies in the plural? Well, it is a majestic expanse. Seas, for example, a majestic expanse of water. But how many seas are there? If we are careful, there's only one body of water and one expanse up there. So even we in the English use those terms, and in a similar way, it exists in the Hebrew. Seas, skies, and in this case, gods, and used as a singular God. And you also need to go and check this out, all right, so that we do not have a misunderstanding of this name. Now getting to the next question. We have a very strange definition. Without form and void. I wonder if you know what this means. What about the water? And what about the darkness? So let me share with you what the Hebrew reveals. At this point in time, I think we all need to be very aware. Verse 1, it speaks of the land and the skies. I have chosen the word the land and the skies so that it is easier for us to understand. Remember, we are by the River Jordan. We are young people trying to understand what Moses is saying. It never speaks of the earth because this is how we've been translating this. And the heavens. These are not preferred. So we have taken these two out, and we are always talking about the land, the promised land, the land itself, and not the earth as a globe. And so in verse 2, you must bear in mind that it is now zooming into the land and later on the skies. That's how the structure of Genesis is all about. So the first part of the description of Genesis from verse 2 onwards is about the land. Always at this point in time, it's the land until we get to day 4. So it is about the state of the land. And this is how I would translate it. If you look at this side of it, and the land existed without shape and without life. And that would be the equivalent of how we have been translating is without form and void. For all the years that we've had an English Bible, what does without form and void actually mean? And so I'm suggesting that for the purpose of our study tonight, without form means no shape. And void itself would be without life, no life. And so it was describing the land in this way. There's no shape on the land and there's no life on the land. And so what exactly actually happened here? Well, you can see two things. Darkness was there above the face of the deep, and the wind of Elohim was moving back and forth above the faces of the waters. So let me explain myself. We've always been reading it this way. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So what is the Spirit of God in this case? First, let me begin by saying this. The land existed in an unformed or without form, or an unfilled and not filled. So no shape, right? No shape and no life, because it was not filled with anything yet. And the description of this without form and not filled, which is no shape and no life, comes in the next two sentences. The next two sentences is what we call a parallelism. This is what I mean by a parallelism. And darkness was upon the face of the deep is one parallel track, and the wind of Elohim was hovering upon the face of the water is the other parallel track. And the description of Hebrew parallelism is that it is trying to say the same thing in two slightly different ways as a form of emphasis. And you know, in Hebrew, there's the right hand and the left hand. So it could be opposites or it could be synonyms. And so this darkness that we read here parallels this. The wind of Elohim is equivalent to the darkness. So you need now to understand, and I've written here these words. Darkness symbolizes the presence of God. And so when you read in Mount Sinai and a number of all these verses where God is present, it is always in darkness. It's always in thick clouds of darkness. It's so thick that you can't see in and you can't see out. And so before light ever came about, darkness was already there. But it was not in the water, it was above the water. The wind of God was also above the water. And so now we have a description of darkness and the wind of Elohim as the presence of God hovering. So you find that above the water would be dark, thick clouds moving back and forth with the wind. And this is about the brooding and the bringing about of new life, because it was unformed and unfilled, no shape and no life. The other thing that we need to be aware of is there is no dry land, but there is land. The land was filled with water. The deep is deep, deep waters. And here waters is a lot of water. So the description up here is about depth, and the description here is about quantity. And so you can see this as a parallel. God was there, and the presence is shown by the wind and darkness in the form of clouds. And you need to know that darkness at this point in time is not absence of light, not necessarily. It is just thick clouds that you can't see anything. Now, since we can't see anything, you could take God's word for it, because he is now describing what is actually happening at that point in time. And so God is moving, God is using this event to bring about life. Now, one thing that you need to take note of is never jump into conclusion whenever you see the word light and darkness, because we have been so used to saying that light is good, darkness is bad. It's not. Everything is good, and darkness itself has a purpose. And so as long as it fits the purpose of God, God made it for a purpose. And so it is good. So let us not misunderstand, because in the Hebrew, at this point in time, God is just telling us the narrative of what's the beginning. Above the land, and in this case, wet land. I would ask you to go back and do your study using your concordances and whatnot, and you find some very interesting thing. The interesting thing is this. We can't see this color, sorry. Let me use this color. Darkness and brightness is not just an adjective or a state, it is also an event and a thing that God can command to move here and there. And hence, when darkness is seen as thick clouds where God is present, and if you have a chance, go back and read how Moses interacted with God on Mount Sinai and the rest of the passages, you find that darkness and brightness is there to fit God's purposes. Now we have our famous question. What is this light? In Genesis 1 verse 3. What does day mean? Does day mean a day, or does day mean a long period of time? And so I just want to show you what the Hebrew says so that you can then derive your own conclusions. In verse 3 and 4, remember, we are still talking about the land. The land is filled with water, and above the water is darkness. Notice, it's not under the water, it's above the water is darkness. Well, technically speaking, you should say that everywhere is darkness, because in the water is darkness, outside the water is darkness. But in this case, God is very specific that this darkness is moving back and forth on the surface of the deep waters. And this darkness describes the presence of God. At least that's how I would see this in the Hebrew. And now in verse 3 and 4, God brings about a balance. And in this balance, an order. The balance is between darkness and brightness. Notice I'm not saying light and darkness. I'm using the term brightness and darkness so that you know that they are both parallel and contemporaries of each other. And so this is what I want to begin to point out to you. Throughout the Bible, and specifically in this chapter, you will always find me translating "and then." which you don't find in the ESV or NKVE or any of the English Bibles, but it also means the same in a proper English linguistics. And God said means exactly the same, and then Elohim commanded. And the reason why I chose this is because this word, and then, is an emphasis which I put in so that we understand that this is what we call sequential order. That when Elohim made this command for the brightness to come, it was after verse 1 and 2. Do you understand this? This is important because this is an action that follows what happened previously. And every so often you'd see that after God did this, he did this, and he did this. So it's a sequential order. Why? So that when you hear the story being narrated, you can follow what happens step by step. If the story gives you 10 things happening at the same time, you won't be able to picture what God has done. And so God is teaching us step by step, one after another. And so now, at this point in time, before verse 3 happens, it was all dark. Moving above the waters is the wind and the clouds. Right? And so God said, let there be light. And that would be our traditional way of saying things. I'm saying that this is the emphasis of God saying, brightness come. And then brightness came. So I'm saying that God actually instructed brightness as if it was a thing to come into his presence. That's how the Hebrew would have worded this. And so in the minds of the young Israelites, they would suddenly see how darkness became brightness. And that's the picture that is being conjured. And so if it was all dark, you would see it slowly coming to be bright. And this is God commanding that brightness comes. And finally, brightness arrives. So it is actually a very interesting sort of way where God is not just saying and then suddenly appears, but it is in a way that it conjures, it's moving, it's listening to God. And that's the picture the Hebrew is bringing. That is hearing God, and suddenly the light came because it heard God. Now, if you look at this verse 4, again, I will point out to you, and then. Because this happens after the brightness have shown up. After brightness came, and then Elohim, not that he saw, which was what we always say, right? God saw that the light was good. I have chosen to translate it this way, that God inspected, because he told the brightness to come, and so God went to check it out. So the word see is not just getting in the light waves into the eyes. It is all encompassing about checking, inspecting, looking attentively, and looking and carefully what the brightness has done, right? And it was good. You see this word here? In our English translation, we always say it was good. So in the Hebrew, good has no meaning. Good has no meaning. What is good? Thumbs up is good. So Hebrew needs to have a concrete element so that you can actually imagine, as the movie goes in your mind, what is good. And so good, tov. You always hear the word mazel tov. So it's tov, right? And doing what it was intended is the Hebrew meaning for good. That when God inspected the brightness actually did what it was told. And so God checked, done. And so it was said it was good. Now, the second thing that God did was he separated, and this is what we read, separated the light from the darkness. Let me help you understand that this is what God actually did. God made it very distinct, intervals of brightness and interval of darkness, so that you can see the darkness and the brightness to be very distinct one from another and not meshed together. Now, this is important for us to see that the moment it is separate and made distinct, all right, then I want to bring your attention to a particular word. And the word is brightness. The word brightness is or. I think that's where we get the word order. Okay? Or is brightness. And by separating the brightness from the darkness in clear intervals, God had brought order into the mesh of brightness and darkness. And so this was what God actually did. And so the English word of separated is actually correct. But the Hebrew gives us the actions of how it was done. All right? And so we have this particular verse in Job chapter 26, verse 10. Job chapter 26, verse 10 says, he drew a circular horizon. And this would be this line over here. The horizon would be sky above, and the line below would be waters. Okay? And so he drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters, at the boundary of light and darkness. So we have a band of darkness and a band of light. It is very important for us to realize that there is a distinction of light and darkness now. And the next thing is this. I want you to see this again. And then, right? And then. It's always, and then after it happened, then God did something else, then God did something else. We always have this word called call. And I use the word gave name. Because this was what God actually did. He gave name to the brightness band, the interval that was bright. He called it day. And the darkness band, he called it night. You need to understand this. It was separated into two distinct bands, day and night. So it's important for us to realize that day and night has a meaning. Okay? Day and night has a meaning. The one who gives name is also the master. So very clearly here, God is the master of both day and night. In this particular case, you would see this. Names always represent character in the Hebrew, even in the Chinese, I think. And God is now teaching us names, day, night. The interesting thing you will find is that the word day, as the name given to the brightness, is exactly the same word day, where it means the whole period of time of night and day. That is something which we need to be very clear of. Which means this, when it is using the same names, then the context will determine what it means. The context. Just like when we looked at the word Elohim, what meaning do we assign to it? The context, whether it's a creator God or it is idols God, same word is used. So the context will determine. So I would urge you that when you read the Bible, tend to ignore the capital letters because it does not exist in the original words, right? Now, the second thing I want to point out to you is this. We always say, and there was evening and there was morning. and it was the first day. I think the Hebrew gives us a much better feel. It says it grew darker and then it grew brighter. This is the process, so that you can see that God did all these things before it turned dark. And now it's getting darker, and then it's getting brighter, and God is teaching men to say, first day. That's how you count. And that's where the Jews start their day at sunset to sunset. And we start our day from midnight to midnight. And so the Jews will begin their day with a meal. We begin our day snoring. Right? The other thing I want to point out to you is the word first. The word first is echad. Just very quickly, if you remember, the first day of the week is also a reference in the book of Acts, where believers of Jesus Christ, we call Christians, and they gathered on the first day of the week. And this is that first day. And why did they gather on the first day? Because the day before is the Sabbath, and nobody comes out on the Sabbath. So the moment the sunset came, the people got together and gathered on the first day of the week, Yom Echad. And so Yom Echad is a very important word. It's the first day. And this is the beginning of the count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is the highlight. Just give me a few minutes. I want to show you something that very few people talk about. And I think those who share about this may have been on the wrong side. The question is what is the firmament or expanse, depending on which version you use? This would be the King James. This would be the ESV and some of the new translations. The question now is there water in space? We have something called a canopy theory. We also have another theory which is seldom talked about, that water is actually at the edge of the universe. That one, I'll leave it for another day. The other question is there water beneath the earth? And I want to wrap up this session, part one, with this explanation. It may be different, but I hope that you pay a little bit of attention, because the Hebrew expresses this. So now we are on verse 6. I'm now no longer using an English word. I'm using a Hebrew word called rakia instead of firmament or expanse. And the rakia, I'm suggesting, it is a thing. It is flat and it's spread out. So think with me, right? Watch. Again, and then. This happened after day one, remember? And then Elohim commanded, Rakia, come in between the waters and let it start making distinct an interval of water and waters. And so what does this mean? This is, again, brightness and darkness separating into two separate intervals. And then one is called day and the other one called night. Here again, the rakia comes into play, splits the water. Remember, the land was covered with water, lots of water and thick water. And then something is supposed to come in between the waters. So if you look at the word expanse and take away this as rakia, it will help us understand that in the middle of the waters, let it separate waters on top, waters below. Understand that it is just like creating two bands, making it distinct. Second word that you need to do your study is that this word rakah as a verb, rakia as a noun, it is the result of what has been rakad. What is rakah? Is to beat, stamp, beat out, spread out, stretch, pound. very much like hammering things into plates. Okay? Rakia then would be the end result of the raka action. And it would be an extended surface, and it's a solid, and this expanse is flat. And so that would be how we would understand rakia. So go and do your study again, just like Elohim and bara. Go and check out the word rakia and raka. This is exactly what it means. It does not mean skies. It does not mean space. It means something flat, and very broad and spread out. And it's hard. And so if you go back and read, say, Exodus chapter 39, right? And this is what happened. They beat the gold into thin plates. So gold plating is raka. Spread over with gold, raka. So the end result is a rakia. And this is what we are trying to explain. So the rakia is this. In chapter 1, verse 2, so you must follow me in this description. There was land here. This is land. And this is water. This is water. And this is land. That's verse 1 and 2. And darkness, lots of thick clouds was over the water. That's what we have in verse 2. And then verse 6 says, and God commanded, let there be a rakia in the middle of the waters. And what does that mean? This is what it means. There is rakia here. And there is water. And there is water. This is what we would commonly call the crust of the earth. And the crust of the earth is a very thin layer compared to the thickness and diameter of the earth. And it covers the entire globe. Now, if this is true in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5, that the earth or the land was standing in the water and out of the water, we need to understand that there is water below the rakia and water above the rakia. And this is the fact that God made the rakia doing exactly what he wanted it to do. You notice these words here, and God made work to be done, and he did exactly what he has said he wanted to do. And so now, if you go and search the internet, you would since find that this is now a much talked about item. That there is lots of water underneath the earth. The deep earth holds about the same amount of water as our oceans. Lots of evidence of water, enough to fill oceans underneath the surface of the earth, underneath the crust of the earth. This one tells us that it is really scary for China, because under China is a body of water that is as big as the Arctic Ocean. Now, lots of research is being done now with regards to water under the earth. We always thought that under the earth was nothing, it was all magma. No, underneath the earth is all water. And if that's the case, this should be a proper description and understanding of rakia. Again, there's another confusion. God gave name, you notice, and then God gave name to the rakia, and he called it Shamayim. And we translate it as heaven. And that's where the English has given us a lot of problem. Why did God call heaven? Well, it's Shamayim. So I would personally ignore this word and call it Shamaim. However, this is the confusion. Shamaim is the same sounding word as skies, called Hashamayim. And so again, when you see the brightness part of the day or the whole day, it is the context. And because of this, gave us a lot of confusion as to what is referred at which point in time. And the Hebrew actually clears this up. And so this is what we have now. We have waters above, waters below, and the rakia called Shamaim. That's what we have. Now, very quickly moving forward. Verse 9 describes the formation of dry ground. In verse 1, there was the skies and the land. In verse 9, it's about dry ground because in verse 2 tells us that the land was covered with water. And now God is describing how that land pops out of the water to make dry land. And it is not the land right underneath, but it is the rakia that is called dry land. And so again, this sequential verb, and then Elohim commanded the waters be collected from the underside of Hashamayim, and we have a challenge. Is this talking about the skies, or is it talking about the rakia? And this is what we need to uncover, okay? And so right now, remember, the land is covered with lots of water. And based on this verse, we can see a couple of things. We have the Hashamayim right at the top. This is the Hashamayim, which we call the skies. And then we have Shamaim, which is the rakia, the crust that I call the crust, okay, for lack of a better word. And then we have water above, water below. Now, I also want to point you to verse 20, and Elohim commanded the waters to breed great numbers, swarming things of living fish and flying things to fly above the land, upon the faces of rakia of Hashamayim. So I'm saying that the faces of Hashamayim is this one here. And it is the face. Now, we call it the face, and the Hebrew calls it the face because it's looking at the earth, or looking at the land, okay? So we call this the face. If this is the face, then this would be the Hashamayim face, okay? Now, this is what we have to uncover. God says, let the water gather in one place under Hashamayim. Now, under Hashamayim could be under this Hashamayim or under this Hashamayim. And so the effects is the same. If you notice, if this is called the face of the Hashamayim, then under the Hashamayim would be here. All right? But the effects is the same depending on how you interpret whether it's under this Hashamayim or under this Hashamayim. So as the water gathers in one place, what happens? As the water gathers in one place, you find this happens. The rakia buckles down, and then when the water is gathered in one place underneath, the rakia buckles up. And this is where dry land appears. And that is the dry land of the Shamaim. See here? The Shamaim. And now Elohim, and then again, gave name. See, God has been giving names, and night and day. This is land and seas. So the land is now given to the dry part of the rakia that popped out of the water. The water's part of it is called the seas in plural, right? The mayim, or and it's that is the whole understanding of the yamim. Okay, the yamim. Yam is sea and yamim is seas. And the collection of the mayim is called the yamim. So you can see that there is some poetry because it uses similar sounding words and similar sounding words to refer to different things, and hence that gives us a confusion in the English in chapter 1. Okay, and so this is what you have. The dry ground is called land. Exactly the same word as in Genesis 1:1. And so how do we know what to use and where it comes in? The context will determine what is meant. Okay? And so this would be our conclusion for this evening. As you can see, as the waters gather together, they are called seas. Plural word, but it's a singular unit of water. Dry land is above the shamayim that pops out of the water. The shamayim that is inside the water is the crust that is wet land, and hence the wet and dry. And if this is true based on the Hebrew, there is also water underneath the rakia. And what I've shown you is current research testing and checking that underneath the earth, instead of the bedrock, they find lots and lots of water. And so some of them even speculate there's even as much water underneath the crust as much as above the crust. And so with this, we have ended 4 days, right? 4 days of the creative narrative. And I hope that you find this useful, because this will help you understand the ambiguity and the awkwardness of some of the English words, and the Hebrew words is supposed to actually give us a whole lot more meaning. Just end. Well, thank you very much for staying for this period of time. I hope that it has helped you figure things out. Please remember, verify everything I have said, because I'm trying to show you what the Hebrew is expressing, in some cases slightly different from how the English may have led us to think. But in each of these contexts, it is to express one very important thing that I want to draw your attention to. It's God doing this in a very particular way, in a very orderly way, systematically, and very sequentially, so that the listeners who hear Moses speak can actually play this movie in their mind. So that's how I'm trying to explain this to you. It's all very action oriented. All right. So thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
We will cover the next round with the rest of the verses. Thank you.
Okay.